Everybody, this is Saad. Rarely do I have repeat guests that can pass the threshold of excellence to be reinvited again. But my current guest, Dr. Aseem Malhotra, academic, clinician, close ally of the Maha movement, and Robert F.J. Kennedy, is back on the show. How you doing, Aseem?
God, it's always a pleasure and honor to be back.
Oh, you're very kind. All right, I went back just to do my homework to check when was that first time that you came. I don't know if you checked also, but if you haven't, just off the top of your head to see if you've got temporal accuracy, do you roughly know when it was?
I think it was April, May 2023. So it was after Dan Rogan, and I think I was in Santa Eulalia, Ibiza.
Well, okay, you're exactly right. May 15th, 2023, which actually happens to be my dad's birthday, May 15th, and he's still around 95
Oh,
years
wow.
old. Yeah. So all right,
Lovely. It's
let's
actually, by the way, I've never done a podcast on my birthday. So this is the first podcast I'm doing on my birthday.
this is your birthday? Of all the things you could be doing, you're sitting with a
Well, yeah, I
boring
mean,
professor on your
no,
birthday.
this is a pleasure for me.
Happy birthday in Arabic. Let me say it in Arabic and then I'll translate. In Arabic, when it's someone's birthday, you say عقبال المية, which means like may you reach to 100, looking to
Oh,
100. So let's
that's the
hope.
plan. Thank you. I appreciate that.
All right. So May 2023, we talked about all kinds of things. We talked about vaccines. We talked about should we use statins or not. I went back to check what we discussed. We discussed all sorts of diets and what are the good ones, the bad ones. Since then till today, fill us in on what's been going on in the world of Dr. Malhotra.
Wow, quite a lot, Gad, to be honest. I think the most significant, how should I put it, events in my life are probably very much linked to the Maha movement because, of course, when we last spoke at that stage, there was no discussion of President Trump and Robert Kennedy Jr. joining forces. And then, since we spoke, of course, I initially then helped when Robert Kennedy Jr. was in his presidential campaign. I was very much helping him with that. Went to organize an event for him in San Jose, California, towards the end of 2023. And then obviously so many things have happened, haven't they? We've been pushing this, this obsession of mine, an obsession of a lot of people, because the major issues around getting more transparency on the COVID vaccine, but in particular asking for it to be halted. And it culminated a couple of months ago with Robert Kennedy Jr. Through HHS basically stopping $500 million worth of investments in the mRNA technology for vaccines specifically, which I think is a big victory, and I think sends a message. So I think there's been a lot of progress on that front. I still think there is a big issue with a lack of sort of accountability, in particular to address all the people who've been vaccine injured. And also, I think, Gad, the other thing to mention as well, I don't want this whole discussion to be about the COVID vaccine. We've lots to talk about, but it's a symptom of a bigger system failure. Really, is that the discussions I've had with very senior people in the CDC is that, and this is my concern as well, is that we are now in a situation where more evidence is emerging that of the long-term harms of these COVID vaccines. And there are question marks certainly around whether or not it may be a driver of cancer. And if it is, then what we want to do is how do we identify people at risk, and then what can we do about it? So these are the discussions going on behind the scenes right now, with very, very senior people in the Trump administration.
So 2 points. Number one, for those of you who don't know, I'm not explaining this to you, but for our listeners, a meta-analysis is a statistical technique that allows us to take a bunch of studies that were conducted by different people, put them together because they are passing certain inclusion metrics, and then imagine them as sort of one mega study to kind of get a bottom line, a snapshot picture of where we are in a particular area of research. So since we last spoke till today, have there been one more or more meta-analyses that would support the claim that the vaccines are harmful, or it's still debatable?
It's a great question. So they haven't done a specific meta-analysis, Gad, but Stephen Hatfill, who's one of the chief medical officers within HHS, who was involved in the analyses that they did to make the decision of stopping the investments moving forward in mRNA technology for vaccines. He described something called a mega, and which I'm not familiar with, but he said that we did a mega analysis. But in other words, I think it's another way of saying we looked at the totality of data up to date data, and they concluded that very clearly it was more harmful than beneficial. And they said that they discovered through hundreds of studies of harm, but also one of the mechanisms that concerned them is that the COVID mRNA vaccines were interfering with tumor suppressor genes. So that means there is a plausible biological plausibility that they could, let me be very careful with my wording here, precipitate cancer. And of course, some data is emerging, observational studies, one from Italy, one from South Korea, suggesting a strong association with vaccinated people and many different types of cancers, in particular in the young. And that's kind of what we are seeing anecdotally as clinicians. We're seeing, I've had friends, people I know in my extended social circle, getting things like colon cancer in the early 40s, which is just very unusual. People with no real family history. So I think that, in my view, the weight of the evidence suggests that it probably is causing or has some carcinogenic potential, but just what severity, what grade, what the strength of that association in terms of also that risk, we haven't fully understood yet, Saad. But I think that in terms of, just to break it down very simply without overcomplicating it, and people can look at this. I had a letter published in the BMJ recently, and that was after a very interesting series of events that happened in the media in relation to me speaking at the Reform UK Party conference, right? And I'll come back to that. But in that, the BMJ, after much pressure and their own internal vetting process, and it was quite extraordinary, they published a 600-word piece for me as a letter. And in that, I wrote a few key points, which is also something coming to your expertise, which I want to ask you about. But what I said was, if you go back to square one, which was the original randomized trials, right, which for people listening is the highest quality level of evidence you can have, right? This is how drug approval occurs. That reanalysis that was done of Pfizer and Moderna's trials by Joseph Freeman, Peter Doshi, Sander Greenland, very eminent data scientists, independent of drug industry influence, they found from the beginning, from square one, you were 2 to 4 times more likely to suffer a serious adverse event from the COVID mRNA vaccines, Pfizer and Moderna in particular. They looked at both those trials, than you were to be hospitalized with COVID. And that serious adverse event rate was about 1 in 800. And that's just in the short term. Gad, this is just at 2 months. And of course, since then, we've got a multitude of studies, whether it's observational studies, whether it's autopsy studies, whether it's clinical data, whether it's plausible biological mechanisms of harm, basically all going in the wrong direction, saying this is actually quite bad. So for me, as someone who has had to U-turn, having took the vaccine, having promoted it on TV for high-risk people, now looking back with hindsight, looking at, was it going to be overall harmful compared to beneficial? When you look at all age groups that were coerced to have it, if you like, it's a slam dunk, as far as I'm concerned, right? And also, if you look at the issue of what are the benefits, and you break down the benefits in similar way as a 1 in 800 harm, for the highest risk groups, Gad, right now, which is people over 90, who are going to get the best benefit, and the only country in the world that has released this data comparing vaccinated versus unvaccinated by age group, not looking at confounders, of course, right? But let's just look at those that data alone. You had to vaccinate 7,000 people over 90 by the end of 2024 for 6 months protection, because that's the longest it will probably give you protection, wow, right? For people over 90. So you've got, and then once you get in the younger age groups, Gad, people under 80, 70, you're talking about tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, then millions of people, especially the young, healthy adults, need to be vaccinated. Prevent one person being hospitalized with COVID, right? So it's really a no-brainer as far as I'm concerned. So the question is, why is this not being accepted? And this is where
I was going to ask you exactly that, because so I'm not familiar with all of the intricacies of that particular data, those data sets. So if I hear you and I presume that everything you're saying has 100% veracity, I'm saying, okay, well, that sounds good to me. So if someone who's sitting instead of me, but who is a detractor of your position is listening to this, what are they rebutting?
Well, they're not really rebutting. That's the problem, Gad. That's why I think there's a problem. They're ignoring. Okay. So there's ignoring. And then this is what's happened in the last few weeks, which I think your listeners will be fascinated by. So, we'll delve into, so ultimately for me, and this is what I've learned in my own journey in the last few years, losing both my parents and almost going through my own spiritual journey, is what I've learned more than anything else, Gad, during the pandemic years, is that the barriers to the truth are primarily psychological. They are not intellectual.
Now we're entering my world.
Right. And you get that. You understand that probably better than anyone. So what I've noticed, and it's sometimes it's we're humans, we're emotional beings, we react, right? So I'm getting all this abuse and backlash, okay, to the stuff I've been doing over the years, but nothing got to the vitriolic attacks towards me, I think culminated at their peak so far with me speaking at the Reform UK. So Reform UK, just for people listening, is one of the political parties in the UK right now. They are at the moment, if there was a general election, which isn't going to happen for 4 years, they would sweep the board. They would be in power. Okay. They asked me, a consultant cardiologist, which is very unusual, by the way, for a party conference, right? It's like a convention. I think you in Canada or US, you call it like a Democratic convention or Republican convention, that kind of thing. They asked me to be a keynote speaker, right, on the main stage. So I had 15 minutes. Everyone had 15, 20 minutes max. And I went over a little bit. And Nigel Farage, who is the leader of Reform UK, basically wanted me essentially to give an update of what's been going on in the US and my role there. But the title of my talk is "How do we make Britain healthy again?" You have the Maha movement in the US, so it's how to make Britain healthy again. And of course, I address what I feel is the root cause of the problem, which is commercial distortions of the scientific evidence. Okay, that for me, it is if not the major root cause of the problem. And of course, to illustrate that fact was to present the data I've just told you on the COVID vaccine, but also what I did. And of course, one can predict this could potentially have caused an uproar, and it did, is that I quoted, and this is where you're going to love this bit. I quoted one of Britain's most eminent, most published oncologists, who's also an immunologist and a vaccine developer, an expert in vaccine development. His name is Professor Angus Dalgleish. Just to give you an idea of just how brilliant this man is, he was actually behind discovering that CD4 cells were involved in HIV and AIDS. Wow. Okay, so he has that background. Okay, he's not just a rookie. He's a guy with a lot of experience. And he asked me when I was going to give this talk, because people have intuitively who are kind of a bit more awake, if you like, to this situation with the potential cancer link. And we had 4 members within a 2-year period, 4 members of one family, probably the most famous family in the world, the royal family of the UK, okay, getting cancer, right? So it's a little bit strange, first of all. And I think anyone who understands any basic science will think, clearly there's been some kind of exposure, something, right, that has caused within a 2-year period of different age groups to all get cancer in a family that doesn't get cancer, okay? So and then when you know that there is a plausible mechanism, and in fact, Angus Dalgleish is much stronger than I am. He's unequivocal in saying that the COVID vaccine causes cancer, especially if you've had boosters, through an immunosuppressive effect. And in fact, there are 5 or 6 different plausible mechanisms that they can do this. So he asked me to say, and I was very careful with my wording, you're a scientist, you get this. I said on stage that one of Britain's most eminent oncologists, Professor Angus Dalgleish, has asked me today to tell you today that he believes that the COVID vaccines have likely played a significant role in cancers of members of the royal family. Okay. Now, all hell broke loose at that point. All the British press were there, the BBC, the Guardian, and then suddenly it turns into, cardiologist links, they didn't mention Dalgleish, which is interesting. They put it all on me, okay, first and foremost, right?
Well, because they could delegitimize you because you are a cardiologist. You're out of your lane. You know nothing about viruses or about oncology. So shut up and stay in your lane, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. It could be. But again, it's about accurate reporting, right? And the question is, why would they also report in the way that they did, which was basically slamming me? And then it was just hatchet jobs in the media for the next couple of weeks, which even culminated. Okay. And this is where things get kind of, I don't know whether it's strange or, again, it comes back to the issue of the psychological barriers to the truth, is where, the situation happens where you are then basically, people are using a straw man argument. So they're painting an extreme version of yourself, picture of yourself, and attacking that and ignoring the nuance, right? And what happens next is the British Prime Minister in a full House in Parliament, like 5 days later, Obviously, I'm now part of a political football because they want to attack Reform. They're threatened by Reform UK. So I'm part of that now, even though I'm not a member of Reform, even though I didn't write their health policy, I was there as a guest speaker. Okay. And Gad, on that point, it's really important again to emphasize this because there's so much polarization of health and it's so become so politicized. I was, and I think I hope maybe I hope you would agree with this. I think you will, but let's just put it out there, right? My duty, my ethical code as a doctor, okay, is to treat people to the best of my ability, regardless of their race, their religion, their sex, okay, their political affiliation. Right. So if people were attacking me for saying, why are you speaking? I said, listen, Malcolm X said, I'm for the truth no matter who tells it. I remember before I went and even Tucker Carlson, at the end of 2022, somebody I respect, very famous, and I respect this guy. I'm not going to name him, right? He's a Jewish doctor, very famous in America. I've been friends with him for a long time, and he messaged me beforehand and said, "Aseem, I'm disappointed that you are going to be interviewed by a white supremacist." Okay,
I have a story about that. Finish your story, but
okay.
I have a story about
But
Tucker.
the point is, I went there because I'm a doctor. I feel this is a big issue. They asked me to speak, and anyway, so I said what I said. Prime Minister gets up in Parliament. Now, there's one thing taking what I said and arguing against it and forming an opinion, but they didn't even do that. He got up in Parliament and basically said to attack reform that you had a man essentially who linked, right, in brackets, all vaccines to cancer. So we've gone from, I'm suggesting there may be a role with Angus Dalglish suggesting COVID vaccine. Now I'm now saying all vaccines and cancer. This is just so it's ridiculous. And he misled Parliament, right? Unwittingly, I think. I wrote this in the BMJ, so it's in the BMJ in my rapid response. And I was like, this is just insane. But I also thought this is great material. Because actually, what's happening in their attacks, Gad, without addressing the nuance, right, which is so important, right? We're talking about trying to be as precise as possible in science, right, as we can, okay? Is that the fact that they are doing this, for me, it tells me they don't really have any strong argument against what I'm saying. They
Right.
can't form a robust argument. And therefore, let's misrepresent Aseem. Let's call him an anti-vaxxer. But Gad, this is the point I'm going to come on to right now. Psychologically, this has a very powerful negative effect in the media. Okay. I don't know if I talked to you about this before, but there's a great documentary called King in the Wilderness about the last 2 years of Martin Luther King's life. And many people don't know that he became one of the most hated men in America. By the way, this is a guy that already had the Nobel Peace Prize, right? Why did he become one of the most hated men in America? He was one of the first to stand up against the Vietnam War. And I remember there's a scene in the documentary where he gets up and he says, people are damning me for saying we shouldn't be killing little brown children in Vietnam. And the press turned on him, right? And he was a tough guy. He could handle it, right? He could handle the press. And they accused him, they said he boarded on trees and all this kind of stuff. But what sent him to clinical depression, right? He went into clinical depression because the effect on the press was so strong that it affected his friends. And his closest friends started turning on him. Now, I'm not going to name this person. I posted on my social media in a very, I felt very nuanced way, saying, one, I'm not a member of Reform. This is a big issue about the COVID vaccine, et cetera, et cetera. This long post. And a family friend, okay, this is going back to childhood. These are Indian community. He's a doctor, someone who's looked up to me. He's a younger kid, right, who I've known since I was literally, 5 years old or whatever else. And his immediate response, without reading whatever, he basically said, "You are." Because I said that, because part of the story is that this instigated the General Medical Council. There were calls, including from the Secretary of State for Health, for the General Medical Council basically to strip my medical license. Okay, this is how extreme it's got, right? So this for me is, potentially a bit stressful, but all on a misrepresentation of what I said. And this guy basically wrote words to the effect of, "You deserve what's coming to you."
Yikes. Well, just to not, I mean, not that misery loves company, but just to show you that you're hardly the only one to go through this. I want to mention the story about Tucker Carlson about another friend. So after I had appeared, so I've appeared many times on Tucker Carlson's show when he had a television show with Fox, but then he had invited me to his, maybe that's where you went, also to his long form podcast. Is that what you did as well?
It was actually, no, it was before his podcast. It was when he was still with Fox,
Ah, okay.
and it was a 1 hour with Fox Nation.
Okay, so I had gone to his studio in Florida, and we had met in person. He met my family. He was very warm, very gracious with our young kids and so on. So when I returned back to the hotel, I posted a tweet saying, hey, and tag Tucker. Hey, Tucker, it was great, seeing you again, and thank you for your, gracious warmth with my family. I received a public tweet reply from my cousin. Now, this is not just a Jewish doctor that you were friends with or the kid who you grew up with or whatever. This is a guy who was my closest friend growing up in Lebanon who went through the Lebanese civil war with me. We hid under the bed when the rockets were coming. So you would think there is an
Wow.
unbreakable bond between us. He was not only was he my closest childhood friend in Lebanon, but he's my cousin. So he writes to me something to the, I don't have the exact tweet in front of me, but have you no shame? And, like, how could you associate with such a person publicly, not even privately? So that's story one. Story two, I was speaking in Savannah, Georgia, this past February, and I knew that an old friend from our days at Cornell, uh, a friend that I've loved. We haven't spent many time together, but one of the loveliest, warmest, kind guys you could ever hope to meet. I knew that he lived in the area at this point, so I reached out to him and I said, "Hey, I'd love to get together with you if you're around. I'm in Savannah. Maybe we could hook up and hang out." He writes me a long thing basically saying, in light of the fact that you seem to be harboring any inkling of a positive response to Donald Trump, I'm afraid that I could no longer pursue my friendship with you. So,
Wow.
so a friendship of 30 plus years is gone. By the way, I'm Canadian, so it's not as though I voted for Donald Trump. But yes, I don't have Trump derangement syndrome. I don't think he's the greatest existential threat ever. That
No.
I lost that friendship. A cousin with whom I grew up and went through the Lebanese civil war. So basically, I don't know if it makes you feel any better.
Yeah.
Yes, it's very painful what you went through, but that's regrettably part of the feature of the architecture of the human mind. It's horrible.
No, absolutely. And I think one of the books I read very recently, which you may be familiar with, Matthias Desmet,
Oh
who's a
yes,
clinical
of course,
psychologist, he
of
wrote The
course.
Psychology of Totalitarianism.
Yes, yes.
And that was fascinating. And that really, I think, for me, is another sort of piece of the jigsaw because when I give my lectures, I tell people that the greatest barrier, I talk about the fact that, what's worse than ignorance is the illusion of knowledge. And, the three components I feel that we can, people can probably relate to during the pandemic is, one is obviously fear and what fear does, right? It inhibits your ability to engage in critical thinking. Then you've got willful blindness, which is linked to that. And then the third part, I think, is this sort of mass hypnosis that Matthias describes, right? That can happen to the extent where even families, will surrender, their own relatives to the state,
Yeah.
right? Who are basically rebelling. I mean, that is absolutely extraordinary. And then you and I have experienced that ourselves, right? And we're like, and of course, with your background, I'm sure it's still hurtful, but you can probably rationalize it because you're an expert in this area.
Well, so to use since we're talking about pathogens and viruses and so on, I think I have an innate inoculation against it to some extent in that I have a personality that allows me to not wilt away. If you rattle me, I'll come back and fight more. So
Yes.
so I have that inoculation. But
Yeah.
as you said, I think earlier, we're all human and it does bother you once in a while. So for example, the fact that I have a lot of family in Israel, and hence when October 7th happened, I was concerned about their safety, as would any human being
Of
be.
course.
Suddenly, so my caring about the safety of my Israeli family became I condone the genocide of Gazan children. So exactly to your point where you were making that point during your speech that was very delineated, that was very specific. It turned into don't take any vaccines, all vaccines cause cancer, and then Dr. Malhotra is a quack. Well, guess what? I am the head of the Mossad, apparently, who is orchestrating the daily genocide of Gazan babies because I care about my Israeli family's safety. So the
Yeah.
world is insane, but that's why I get up every day, by the way, with sort of anticipation because I'd like to think, with my optimistic nature,
Yeah.
that we could develop the mind vaccine to fight against all this nonsense.
Yeah, absolutely, Gad. And actually, there's a great for people listening. There's a video I've watched and shared with so many people called "Why Do Intelligent People Believe Stupid Things?" I don't know if it's after school on YouTube,
Yeah. Yeah.
and essentially, what's the crux of all of it is that the what is it about? It's not so much about intelligence; it's about your character that allows you to get to a greater truth. And the most important characteristic is, and it's not easy because I think I don't know whether you can. Maybe Jordan Peterson talked about whether I don't know if there's a correlation between intelligence and narcissism, but it's about being humble, right? And that's part of your personal spiritual growth as one is that
100%.
go into a conversation. I mean, Charlie Kirk mentioned this as well, right? Go into a conversation thinking you could be wrong, right? How do we encourage a culture, Gad? Right? How do we encourage a culture where we teach kids about humility, about the fact that things may change, new information emerges, even coming back to the basics of just realizing there's 7 billion of us on this planet. And it's self-evident that there is more that we don't know than we actually do know.
And actually,
That's where we should start from,
yeah,
shouldn't it?
yeah, absolutely. So there is actually, by the way, a psychometric scale that measures intellectual and epistemic humility. It came out a few years ago. So you can
Oh wow.
actually administer this to people to get their scores on how they score. In the same way that you can get on a scale to measure your weight, you can find out whether Aseem scores here or here on intellectual humility. But to build further on your excellent point. So if you look at someone like Joe Rogan or someone like Elon Musk, or if I dare say, in however successful I've been in my own career and in hosting people like yourself, it takes humility to be able to say, you know what, when it comes to cardiology, it is perfectly reasonable that I probably know 0.01% of what Aseem Malhotra knows. And that doesn't in any way diminish me. As a matter of fact, that's why I'm inviting him for a conversation on my show, because I concede the fact that the guest that I'm inviting has something interesting to say that I probably know very little about. So why did Joe Rogan develop the platform that he did? Because he sits with people and he doesn't presume that every single guest that's there he knows more than them. I sat with Elon Musk for 4+ hours at his house. I've never seen someone so humble. You could think, I mean, he's going to talk over me. He's going to exact opposite.
Yeah.
We were locked in, two guys having a conversation, zero ego. We each know that we bring something to the table, but we are not in any way diminished by the fact that the interlocutor, might know a million more things than me on a million things. That's what makes life beautiful. On the other hand, I could tell you, I have family members who, if Dr. Malhotra, the cardiologist, sat with them and they asked you about the heart, you would never be able to finish a sentence because they would be teaching you about heart surgery, even though they never finished elementary school. That's the narcissism. And by the way,
Wow.
many of those family members I'm estranged with because I simply could not stomach that anymore. So.
Yeah. Wow. Interesting. So interesting. So I think I just wonder how you feel. Obviously, we're in this, I don't know, I think revolutionary time. There's a lot of polarization, there's tribalism. Okay. We see it. We see it on social media. It's exacerbated probably by the social media algorithms as well. And Kenny talks about healing the divide. And I think we need to do that. But I don't know whether we figured out exactly how to do that yet, Gad. I mean, I sometimes see myself as a bit of a Trojan horse because I come from traditional left leaning politics. Okay. Traditional left, right? Not woke left.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Traditional left, right? But I have tried, but my friendships are across the board, right? Because I speak to everybody, and now I'm much more now. I wouldn't say that I align myself with the left or the right. I'm just for evidence-based medicine. I'm for the truth. I'm for improving patient outcomes. I'm for understanding how do we get better psychological health. It's a learning process for me. But actually, what was interesting is the concepts I talk about when I talk about what is it that builds a healthy society? And there's something called the socioeconomic or biopsychosocial determinants of health at the base, right? Basic needs being met are the most important, the first stage. Have you got enough food to eat? Have you got housing, right? If these are not met, then you can't really advance. And I talk about concepts that are traditionally probably thought to be very left. And I'm going to these places, Gad, and this is over the last few years, all across America, where most of the most receptive audience to me are people from the ideological right, and I'm getting standing ovations. And I'm thinking, it's so interesting, right? And I'm telling them concepts. I'm talking about things that normally is very, very strongly embraced by the left, right? But I'm just for evidence based. Okay, I'm for evidence based medicine. So I just find that really interesting. But it gives me hope that if it's about enough people almost in the middle, having humility, having compassion, and it's not always easy because it's almost like how does one try and engage in a conversation with someone that has verbally abused you? Right? I see that as a challenge. Actually, I see it as a challenge for myself. Right? And I think we need more people who are doing that, and I think we can then hopefully bridge these very unhelpful and I think detrimental to society divisions.
I agree. So just yesterday, do you know who Mehdi Hassan is?
I do.
Yeah.
Yes.
So just yesterday, I was exchanging. It wasn't very pleasant, but not to any of my doing. Uh, Back and forth with him. But right away, I was, a genocide supporter. I was committing genocide. I was, and so on. Uh, I would love the opportunity. I mean, whether it be Mehdi or someone else, he's just an exemplar of the point that
Yeah.
you're making. I would love to be able to invite on my show people that are perfectly antithetical to anything that I'm saying, right? They love Islam. Islam is peace. You're an Islamophobe, God. You're a hater. Okay, let's sit down and have a conversation. I can't have a conversation with them. I genuinely cannot. Not because I'm not willing to, but because it right away, you know, heads into the ad hominems and the so on. There's a whole bunch of these kinds of characters. I mean, it's probably not a good idea for me to have a conversation with Muhammad Hijab. I don't know if you know who he is. He's
Yeah.
another sort of British extremist guy. But I would love to invite these guys. I even had, by the way, on this show many years ago, a former radical kind of ISIS type of guy who had kind of de-radicalized, and he came on the show and we had a very productive conversation. I've had Imam Tawhidi on, although he's hardly radical, he's actually quite liberal in his views for an Islamic imam. So I'm willing to have conversations with everyone, but you're right. The reflex is for people to demonize you and then other you, and then I don't want to talk to you. And by the way,
Yeah.
that's what made Charlie great, Kirk so great, right? Because he did it as his primary job to go into the Dians, into the Viper's den, and have these incredible conversations and be gracious and be smiley. Yeah, sometimes he was a bit punchy and spicy, but that's the great loss of Charlie Kirk because so few of us
Yes.
pull off what he was able to do.
Yeah. And Gad, I want to ask you about this as well. What you think? My understanding is that one of the reasons we have these very polarized positions and views and vitriolic, you know, so-called arguments or debates is, and just bear with me with this, as a broadly used term, I think, is colonial thinking. And what I mean by that is people who actually believe that other human beings are less worthy, right? This is, I mean, to take an extreme example, and please forgive me, but you know this yourself, probably, it's something that I'm sure close to your heart, is how obviously did the Holocaust happen, and it was basically dehumanizing Jews,
Right.
right? But I think that this is something all inherent potentially. Maybe this is part of our primitive brain, right? Animalistic brain or whatever else. I think that's where the problem is. That really is at the root of the problem. I think when you have, I mean, listen, I have embraced Buddhism, right? It's given me a lot of strength in the last few years. I'm a Hindu. I was born a Hindu, but I've embraced Buddhism. And of course, the Buddhist philosophy thinking is that essentially there are three stages of compassion. The first stage is you accept everybody else as equal to you. The second stage is that you put other people's needs ahead of your own. Okay, and I'm not saying we this is something that everybody can do all the time, but sometimes we do obviously do this. And then the third, which is true altruism, is taking on the burden of others. And the one situation in life where that happens unequivocally is a mother's love for their child.
Right.
Right. So that's like the most extreme form of compassion. Whether that can be translated to us, to the broader community is a challenge. But for me, I think that's the problem, Gad. That's the real issue. Why these debates and these discussions happening is that the people start off from a position thinking, I am a superior being, or I have more value, my life is more valuable than yours. I'm just wondering what you think about that, whether from
Yeah.
a psychological
So
perspective,
yeah,
is that what's driving a lot of
yeah.
this?
Thank you for the question. I mean, certainly that could be part of it, but so 2 points I want to make to address your point. Number one, I'm glad you mentioned Buddhism because in my forthcoming book, Suicidal Empathy, when I'm talking about various ways by which empathy can go wrong,
Yes.
actually it was, and I credit him in the, because I'm very, very assiduous to credit people, even in personal conversations. Someone wrote to me and said, "Hey, Professor Saad, I don't know if you know about this, but in Tibetan Buddhist philosophy, there's the concept of idiot compassion, which in a sense links. Now, it's not my framework of suicidal empathy, but I
Yeah.
ended up citing that principle from a Tibetan Buddhist master, so that even in the context of Buddhist philosophy, where sort of the highest ideal is to be, infinitely compassionate,
Yeah.
there is a point of diminishing return where your
Yes.
infinite compassion, to use their term, becomes idiotic compassion. So that's point number two. Point
Yeah.
number one. Point number two, and I think I might have sent this to you privately at one point. You had reached out to me to ask me about, why is it that people don't change their minds in light of incoming information. So I don't know if I had mentioned this then to you, and if I have, apologies if it's repetitive, but for our audience, it may not be repetitive. There is this great book, and I want to bring it out and show it to you. So this book, I think I might have shared it with you. It's called
Ah,
The Enigma of Reason.
yeah.
And every time I share this book, it's probably the fifth, sixth time on my show that I've shared this book. No, I'm not getting royalties for plugging their book, although I think I should start getting royalties. But it's written by two French psychologists, both very much evolutionarily minded, and I'll explain in a second why that's important. So the faculty of reasoning, of to reason that humans have, we can study it from an evolutionary perspective to say, well, why did human beings evolve the capacity to reason? What evolutionary problem does it solve? And now you're going to see how I'm going to link it with some of the stuff you're talking about. And what they say in their book, which regrettably I agree with, is that we didn't evolve the capacity to reason to achieve some objective truth, but rather to win arguments.
Yes.
Right? So that speaks to the ego. I'm superior to you. I am in group A, you're in group B. I don't care if my
Mm,
position is veridical. That's not the point. The
right.
point is
Yeah.
that Dr. Malhotra will never say anything that invalidates my position. I will die before I concede to him. Now, and by the way, I take that point, and in chapter 7 of The Parasitic Mind, where the chapter is titled How to Seek Truth. So I am about to propose an epistemological procedure to seek truth, but yet I start with their story, which says people don't want the truth. So therein lies the conundrum, because we've
Yeah.
got the tools to seek truth, but most people don't care about the truth. They care about their team winning.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. And in fact, on that as well, because it's a big discussion going in the UK right now, there's a push by the Prime Minister to push these digital IDs. And
Yeah,
of course, part of that, people are, understandably skeptical about it being misused, is around, and it's a topic comes up again and again and again, is around free speech, freedom of speech. And I think because we mentioned earlier the fact that you can't get to a greater truth. Well, basically, you can't get to a greater truth unless you listen to all sides.
yeah,
And Kennedy said, Robert Kennedy said at a rally I attended before the last election called Rescue the Republic, on which I love this line. He said, "The solution to bad speech is not censorship; it's more speech."
of course.
Right. And I think again, that's something I don't know, Gad, whether it's something that I claim to go. I've been to the best school in the world, right? I'm very proud of my school. It's called Manchester Grammar School. It's over 500 years old. Our motto at Manchester Grammar was Sapere Aude, which in Latin means dare to be wise. It comes from, I think, Immanuel Kant, the Enlightenment,
Oh, sure.
right. Do not let fear subdue your ability to reason. But I don't remember, interestingly, being it, maybe it was intuitive, but it wasn't necessarily something I remember being taught in school about the importance of freedom of speech and how we've got to where we are, the evolution of Western society and how important it is. And it all seems to be getting undermined by people. I believe, and I'd love to hear your view on this, by a so-called oligarchy of people that have got to their positions of power where they believe they know what's best for us.
Yeah.
And they actually believe it, Gad. I don't think there's any conspiracy. I don't think some evil cabal. These are psychological barriers here.
I agree. So in suicidal empathy, I have a chapter where I talk about forbidden knowledge, right? And so forbidden knowledge has a very specific term in the context of academia, right?
Yeah.
Don't do research on race differences because then if the results come out in a way that might be problematic from a politically correct narrative, then that's going to further marginalize the group in question. So therefore, that should be filed away under forbidden knowledge. But I argue in the book
Yeah.
that the reflex, to your point, the
Yeah.
reflex for whomever is in power to then say that which I disagree with and then fill in the blank. We can call it dangerous. We could call it blasphemous. We could
Yes.
call it hate speech. We could call it disinformation. We could call
Yes.
it misinformation. So the reflex to stifle those who are below us is an indelible feature of the human condition, right?
Right.
I mean, the Inquisition, right, was exactly that. There is an official church doctrine, set of doctrines, and if you go against it, even if you're called Galileo, then we might come after you because how dare you say that it's not the earth that's at the center of the universe. And so when you get someone like Joe Biden, I don't know if you remember, I can't remember her name, I cite her in the book, when he appointed someone to be, and it was very short lived, to be a czar of disinformation. Her name was Nina something. Do you remember her? She did a viral clip where she was singing.
Yeah.
Do you remember
Yeah.
that?
Yeah.
That in the 21st century, the President of the United States thought that it was a good idea to have a czar of disinformation tells you that Orwell was right.
Yes. No, absolutely. And one other thing that people I discovered as well, like I kind of was aware of this over my last 10, 15 years as a public health campaigner and activist where I've had access to politicians and leaders across different parties, is that I think people don't understand the level of ignorance and ineptitude amongst people in leadership positions. And linked to that as well is when you have, in my view, one of the big issues we have right now, I call it, a big pharma tyranny or corporate totalitarianism, whatever you want to, there are different problems going on in the world, right? But, or different factors that are contributing to the sort of, to the detriment of our mental, of our mental, physical, and social well-being. But one of the things that's really interesting is, and this again got a lot of attention on social media recently, is that President Trump had his, I think his 6 monthly, health check. Okay. And there was a post from the White House where they mentioned that he had the COVID-19 booster.
Oh, I know where you're going with this. Yes, I saw
Right.
your thing.
And,
Yes.
and then people are automatically thinking, no, he didn't have it. It's fake. And I was like, no, I actually believe he has it. I believe that President Trump believes in this COVID vaccine. But also the other interesting thing is I was given his, it's public knowledge anyway. There have been observations. Listen, I think President Trump as a 79-year-old president, I think is remarkable in terms of his energy and what he does, right? And he only sleeps 4 hours a night. But there have been some, there's some press reports and some observations, even from people close to the president who contact me, who I will not name, who have said, yeah, there are moments where he's kind of falling asleep or whatever, and that could be just a natural thing. But it could also be the fact that he's taking a statin. Right. So I'm again a precise doctor. I look at his whole cardiovascular risk profile. We know what his cardiac status is. I know what the benefit of a statin is in this situation is close to zero. It's, you have to vaccinate. You have to give a statin to 446 people to prevent one heart attack or stroke, right? With no prolongation of life, so no real significant benefit. And it comes with side effects, which are more prevalent as you get older. One of them being brain fog, fatigue, all right, and muscle pain. And I see this all the time as a clinician. I have patients coming to me, Saad, and I'm not talking Gad, sorry, and I'm not talking about, I'm not I'm not saying this is President Trump, but for example, there are people who come to me as patients who have literally, have been diagnosed that they may have early dementia. Some of the family thinking, hold on a minute, I don't believe this is the case. The doctor won't stop the statin. They come and have a consultation with me. I go through the whole history and I say, listen, you know what? I don't think this is dementia, but we can do something here. We can try off your statin for 2 to 3 weeks. Because if it is that, you'll notice very quickly. And Gad, I've lost count of the amount of patients who've come back. They cannot believe, how they feel afterwards. They're much more alert. They're more energized. They're sleeping better, right? And it was all the time it was the statin. So I went public, obviously, with this. I tried to get through because I said, I genuinely want to help the president. I want him to be the best president he can be. And I'm like, also as a doctor, I'm like, I'm watching this. This is crazy. He's on aspirin as well. He doesn't need to be on aspirin. It's more likely to cause him a bleed than prevent him from a heart attack. Well, I know that because we've seen his cardiovascular risk status. We know he's okay. And this is insane. But what it also represents for me is that, I said this in my talks in terms of the medical misinformation mess. And this is a phrase that came from Professor John Ioannidis, you may be familiar with, professor of Stanford, right? Of course. Yeah, the most cited medical researcher in the world, right? Yeah. And he wrote this paper in 2017, which people can look up and you can read. It's excellent, called How to Survive the Medical Misinformation Mess. And he talks about the fact that most doctors are unaware of the poor quality research that drives, medical decision making. At one stage, he said most published research findings are false in medicine, right? But he said ignorance of this problem at the highest levels of academic and clinical leadership is profound.
Yeah.
So don't presume that even the Surgeon General may even know this stuff. So for me, knowing all of that, I have no doubt that President Trump's physician and even President Trump are actually believing in this without even breaking the data down into its individual parts. And part of it, I think, is because of this system, this ideological system that has basically become subservient, right, wittingly or unwittingly, to the interests of big pharmaceutical companies and purely their profit motive, right? That's what it is. So my point is, I think there is no conspiracy. I don't think President Trump is pretending. I actually think that no one is immune, even the president, to medical misinformation because of the system.
So if I asked you to allocate 100 points to reflect the relative influence of the following two factors, pharmaceutical profit-seeking nefarious motives versus all of the other psychological barriers that stop people from either getting at the truth or revising their opinions when facing contrary evidence. So one is nefarious pharmaceutical money stuff. Two, the psychological architecture of the human mind that makes it feeble to truth. How many points do you allocate to those two? So again,
out of 100.
Out of 100. So if it were, 90,
like 60, 40, 90,
60, okay, 40, wow. 50, 50, they're equal 50, 50.
That's a great question, Gad. With humility, I don't, you may have a better idea than I would, but my intuitive, intelligent response from my own experience is, I would say, and from following on from our conversation, I would say 60-40, but they're linked anyway, more in favor of the psychological.
I was certainly going to go more psychological than nefarious.
Yes.
I might even go slightly higher than 60. I might say that in the same way.
But can I say, sorry to interrupt you, please. But can I say, I don't think it's nefarious, actually.
You mean nefarious even on the pharmaceutical side?
Yeah, I think it's like a, I don't know how to describe it. I think it's an ideology to some degree. I don't think Albert Bourla, the CEO of Pfizer, is sitting there thinking that, I'm going to completely cover up all potential vaccine injuries, whatever else. I think there's something that switches on in his brain that he wants to try and do good with his products, but it causes him to have a massive deliberate blind spot, almost maybe subconsciously, to the harms. Now, I'm not saying there aren't nefarious CEOs out there, okay?
Okay, but then what you just said, I would put that under psychological barrier then.
There you go.
That wouldn't go under pharmaceutical.
So it's primarily psychological then,
there you go.
I think, Gad.
Okay,
Yeah.
got. All right, let's switch to a few personal. I mean, not deeply personal, but number one, why did you choose cardiology? And let me before I ask you to answer this, let me give you the background. So my doctoral dissertation was in psychology of decision making, right? I specifically looked at how much information do people look at before they stop collecting additional information and commit to a choice. So those are called stopping rules, right? If I'm choosing between two cars or I'm choosing between two prospective women to marry, I don't look at all of the available information. I look at enough information that it becomes clear to me that I should marry girl A or I should buy car B, right? So my original training was in psychology of decision making. So under that, in the spirit of that background, you could have chosen 60 different medical specialties, yet somehow you went into cardiology. Why?
Okay, so at school, I had a lot of variety of interests in terms of subject matter. And I actually, my favorite subject, interestingly, was history.
Mm.
And the reason history was most interesting to me, Gad, and just to answer your question, because I think it may help you understand who I am as a complete doctor, if you like, is that we were taught in my school about bias. And I came almost top in the year. I came second in the end. And my school was like the top school in the country. And I'm not blowing my own trumpet here saying I was like
Yeah,
whatever
yeah.
best of the best, but I was a straight A student. And for me, I was always good at, but topic. But the thing I enjoyed the most was history because we weren't just taught about historical facts. We were taught about bias, right? We were taught about critical thinking. And specifically, in my second year in what we call high school, in fact, no, I think it was a bit later than that. The big topic was actually World War II and the Holocaust. And I remember being presented in class of things where they would show these cartoon figures where they were demonizing Jewish people. And the history teacher was asked, what do you think of this, guys? What else is missing, right? What's not there that gives you a more complete truth, right, of what's going on? So that's where I got, and that was what I really enjoyed. And the reason I mentioned that is up until the last minute, in many ways, I wanted to be a lawyer. And I grew up with loving debate, loving having an intrinsic, how should I put it, an intrinsic aversion to any injustice around me. And some of that, Gad, and you can relate to this as well, may well have been by the fact that I grew up in the north of England, where I had two parents that were doctors. We were Indian background. I had a brother with Down syndrome. But I grew up in a place where it was not unusual for me to be called names. And we were even attacked once by neo-Nazis.
Wow.
Okay. So I grew up in that kind of environment where even as a kid, Gad, I sometimes would make excuses that I was sick so that to stop, like on the weekend, my parents would want to go out shopping, for example, into the city center. I knew there's a very good chance someone's going to call us Paki or something like that, some racial term. And my dad wasn't a shrinking violet type of guy. He was a guy that wouldn't care. He'd be up for a fight. And I didn't, as a kid, I was scared to see something would go wrong. Right. So let's give you an example. And I don't know whether that came from that. My dad was also someone that, always stood up against injustice. So I had this thing about initially my experiences of that and seeing and being very sensitive to racism. Right. Now, of course, things evolved and progressed. And I can't remember the last time anyone called me a name such as that. There are different types of biases and racism is still there. And I think it's something we're all vulnerable to. Okay. But I think that sense of injustice started there. And then what happened? And then, I think because both my parents were doctors, there was always a little bit of that,
You have to
influence.
follow. You have to follow in their footstep. You're
A
expected.
little bit, but my parents were actually for Indian family parents were actually relatively cool. They wanted me to follow my passion, so they never really pushed me down that route. But there was an intrinsic, so there was a natural influence there. My brother had a heart condition, which wasn't going to kill him. He had a hole in his heart. He had Down syndrome. But at the age of 13, when I was 11, he got a viral infection. And it was very traumatic for the family because out of the blue, within 5 or 6 days, unexpectedly, he went into crashing heart failure and died.
Oh my God.
And that I think as an 11-year-old child definitely had a profound impact on me. And I remember, my mom crying and my father, and you want to console them. And it's like, okay, I remember saying something like, I'm going to be a cardiologist so I can make sure, kids like my brother don't die unnecessarily or whatever else. And so there was always that, I think, in me. And then the reason I decided not to go into law is I had a family, a relative who was a lawyer. And they said to me, I never forget this, said, Aseem, remember one thing, being a lawyer isn't so much about fighting injustice, it's about winning. So go in with open eyes to know, and it put me off a little bit.
Well,
And
it speaks to this book, right? It's about winning the argument, not about getting
yes,
to truth.
exactly.
Right.
So I decided in the end to do medicine. I was still good at biology and sciences. I had a bit more of an interest in history, whatever. And so I went to do medicine. And then once I was in medical school, there was, part of it was I was fascinated with the heart. Listen, I was also a competitive guy, Gad. I played sports, I captained sports teams, and there was a bit of this kind of there was slightly like, okay, cardiology is really tough. Like it's
Right.
it's it's kind of it's super competitive. It's a bottleneck. Only a certain percentage of the doctors can hack it. And it's a very and so I said, you know what, I like that challenge. I like the idea of cardiology. I was fascinated with the heart, and that's why I pursued it. And I don't look back. But just to give you an example in terms of I chose interventional cardiology originally, which is a subset of cardiology, which is keyhole heart surgery, which is even more competitive. And it was literally, and this hardened me up. And I think that's one of the reasons I'm able to do what I do, is because it was almost like a military style type of environment, right? I remember there was this amazing cardiologist and really good at what he did, but he had some anger management type of issues. And if you screwed up in the operating theater, I mean, he was throwing scalpels around, that kind of stuff at people. He was he
Wow.
was he was sending people into tears. And I'd come down from Manchester. I'd worked in my final training in cardiology, and I was kind of the tough, hard. In England, there's a thing. You're from the north. You're a bit harder. You're a bit more toughened up. I trained in Scotland. The first hospital I worked in was one of the most deprived areas of the whole country, where you have teenagers coming on with liver failure from alcoholism.
Wow.
You have I worked in the most busy ER in the whole country, where we had gangland shootings and stabbings. So I was really hardened up by the time I got into the interventional cardiology circuit. So for me, I was taking my stride, and this guy's looking at me, and he was making other people cry, and I was just taking it very cool in my stride and just doing my thing. So yeah, that was kind of my journey before I became an activist, just to give you an idea.
But
So
but
so nothing compares. All this big pharma stuff and people attacking me and the prime minister. I was like, nah, this is nothing compared to my boss in cardiology, right? Trying to scare the shit out of me.
I could link what you said about the seeking justice as a lawyer and then what happened to your brother tragically. In a sense, you becoming a cardiologist, you were seeking to resolve the cosmic injustice that your brother faced. So, in a sense, you became a cardiologist also to pursue injustice. Why? I mean, I don't know if you've seen some
Wow.
of those footages of young soccer players. I mean, I just showed one yesterday to my wife, and she said, "Why are you showing me this? Did you see that famous footage of this guy soccer player, and he just drops dead of cardiac arrest, and then all
Yes.
the teammates kind of drop, and they're like in literal shock. They're like
Yeah.
crying,
Yeah.
right? I mean, that's cosmic injustice, man. I mean, what could be more unjust
Sure.
than a 27-year-old perfectly healthy guy? One minute he is making a dribble, the next minute he's off the earth.
Yeah, no, no one's ever said that to me. That's so interesting. Well, you've diagnosed actually my path. No, it
That's the
makes sense.
psychologist.
It makes sense, Gad. No,
Right.
totally.
Oh, good. Well, I'm glad to have been of service.
Yeah.
One last question for you before I let you go. Uh, about a couple of years ago, when my happiness book came out, it was a tradition for me to ask it. Then I stopped doing it, but let's revive the tradition. So, in one of my last chapters in the happiness book, I talk about sort of a life well lived is one where hopefully when you're 85, 90 years old on the proverbial porch and you're looking back at your life, you've got as few regrets as possible. And one of my former doctoral professors in psychology is a gentleman by the name of Tom Gilovich, Professor Tom Gilovich, who was one of the pioneers of studying the psychology of regret, specifically the regret due to inaction versus regret due to action. Regret due to action would be, I regret that I cheated on my wife and now my marriage is over. Regret due to inaction, I regret the fact that I became a cardiologist because my dad was a cardiologist, but really I always wanted to be an artist, an architect. And so I wake up at 60 and I regret the fact that in a sense I've lived an inauthentic life. I've lived someone else desire for the life that I should lead. Now, it turns out, as you probably can guess, that the biggest looming regrets in people's lives are those due to inaction rather than due to action. So if I now turn the FBI light on you and say, you're still a young man, so you still have a lot of life to live, what would be the biggest looming regret or regrets that you currently have?
As you've been talking, I've been thinking about this. Um, as you probably know, Gad, and we suffering is an inevitable part of life. We're all going to experience it, and of course, we want to live a life where we minimize that suffering, or at least increase our resilience to it. Right? This is part of of growth. For me, I think the most difficult part of the last few years of my life has been the absence of my parents, who died prematurely, partly due to system failures. So if I was to reflect on, I'm not one for regrets. I'm a half a glass half full guy. Every experience is something for learning, and you move forward from it.
Right.
But if there's one regret I have, Gad, and maybe other people can, maybe it can help them think about it a little bit where they are right now, is actually not spending more time with my parents and telling them how much I love them.
Wow. Wow. But believe me, by the way, and I won't get into it, it even touches me in a way. Uh, my father is 95, my mother is 91, so I appreciate that very much. Aseem,
Because God, one final point is
please.
I think one thing, there's nothing like the unconditional love of your parents. And
True.
when it's gone, it never comes back. They're in your heart, but there's nothing like that, God. There's nothing like that.
And I'm not, I don't mean to in any way minimize. I hope you'll appreciate it. I think the only place you can find it,
Yeah.
but not with bipedals, would be go for the quadrupedals. Dogs might give you the unconditional love that your
Yes.
parents do, but you
Yeah.
are correct that if it comes to other human beings, you're probably hard pressed to find someone who's going to love you more than your parents. So, point
Yeah.
taken. Uh,
Absolutely.
Aseem, I can't wait for your repeat. Now we've only had a repeat. I look
Yeah.
forward to your next visit. Anything that you want to plug, a project you're working on, a book that you're thinking of writing before we wrap this up, take it away.
That's really kind, Gad. One of the things that we're doing, I made this documentary film, independent film called First Do No Farm, and people can download that by going to nofarmfilm.com, PHARM, is that we're now in a stage where we've got some interest from Hollywood to try and make another film for an Oscar campaign, essentially, really to help change, not for any other reason, but to just help shift, heal this divide, get to the truth around big pharma and people's health. So people can privately reach out to me if they're interested in investing in that movie, because we have all the ingredients of a great documentary story here, a big arc of the story, speaking truth to power, the appointment of Robert Kennedy Jr. and trying to give people the greater truth that's missing. So that's the only thing. And of course, people can direct message me on Instagram on Lifestyle Medicine Doctor. I'm on X as Dr. Aseem Malhotra. Or even just email me. My email's public anyway. So it's Aseem_Malhotra@hotmail.com.
Well, I will say this, and I mentioned this before I came on to my wife. I said, the more I know people, the more I love dogs. It's not me who came up with this thing. But I said, but the next guest that I have on, she's never met you, might be one of the rare violations of that dictum because you are a true scholar and gentleman. It is a pleasure to call you my friend.
So kind.
Thank you so much for coming on. Come back again anytime. Stay on the line so we could say goodbye offline. And thanks again for coming on. Cheers.
Thank you.